Okay, let's start with the first question. Jacob, do you have them in front of you?
I don't. Do you want me to bring them up?
No, I have them here. So I'll
Okay, I don't have them in front of me because my computer makes a bunch of noise, so I turned it off.
I'll read them aloud if you guys want to follow along. Okay, first and foremost, we just completed an activity highlighting 10 of the most commonly described PDs. And given your background and experience, the first question is, can you provide us with a brief overview of narcissistic personality disorder, including the diagnostic criteria and common characteristics?
Great, of course, yeah. I guess that's a good place to start off, isn't it? Yeah, so what is narcissism? I would like to start off by saying that there's been a lot of contention in the academic community about the current diagnostic criteria. There's actually some talk about completely just getting rid of the disorder just because of how ineffectual the current criteria are. Because mainly the criteria nowadays only really describe external behaviors and doesn't really dive into the internal experience of someone with the disorder. I think in the slides that you provided, you actually showed the alternative criteria from the section 3 of the DSM, which is by far a better way of describing NPD than the current situation we have. That was actually supposed to replace the current diagnostic criteria, but at the last second, it was nixed because there was some like drama and politics. It was stupid. Anyways, but basically, I would describe NPD primarily of a disorder of self-esteem. Basically, we rely on external factors to regulate our own self-worth, which can basically lead us into being either very thinking that we're better than everybody else if we're getting a bunch of attention and a bunch of good things are happening to us, or thinking we're worse than everybody else if we aren't getting that, right? And emotional regulation often coincides with these states. If somebody's in a more grandiose state, they tend to be a lot less neurotic. They tend to be a lot more, just very stable. On the other hand, when they're vulnerable, they'll get very neurotic, very quick to anger, very paranoid, stuff like that. And I mean, emotional dysregulation is obviously a factor of all cluster B disorders, but that's when you start to see the symptoms really show there, when those kind of cracks in the grandiose facade start going. But I do have the diagnostic criteria here that I'll go through briefly just because it is the current diagnostic criteria, so I feel like it's important to go through. So grandiosity, a grandiose sense of self-importance, basically thinking you're better than everybody. And I do emphasize the word better than everybody because I think a lot of people mistake grandiosity for self-love. Me, for example, having NPD and based on my research and the other people I know who also have NPD, there isn't any self-love there. We're basically trying to rank ourselves in reference to everyone around us, trying to be better than them, because that's how we feel good about ourselves. But there's still no self-love. My internal monologue when I mess something up is, you're so stupid. You're so much better than all these people. How could you allow yourself to do something stupid like the rest of these degenerates or whatever? I think the hierarchical thinking in narcissism really shines in the grandiose sense of self-importance. Chronic envy or believing others envy him or her. Basically, like envy in NPD is like constant. Anybody who has anything, and it also kind of goes hand in hand with entitlement because it's like, oh, I should be the one having that, right? It's like, for example, this is a kind of an extreme example, but a big portion of my envy comes when I think about, let's say, a billionaire. I'm like, well, if I have what he had, I could do way better. And you can also see the kind of grandiosity and arrogance there. But it also applies to very minute things in really bizarre ways. For example, I own a house and I have a friend who had an apartment who was renting one. And I became envious of it for like kind of no reason. I was like, oh, this place is so quaint. I wish I had this place despite owning a house. It can present in very bizarre ways, and it's universal to a lot, to basically everything. The need for admiration. I think this is probably the most prominent feature of NPD, and according to some research, does support that. Because of our need to regulate our self-esteem externally, we're constantly looking for people to basically validate us and to tell us that we're better than other people, that we're the best thing that's ever happened, et cetera, et cetera. And when we don't get that, we can fall into depressive states. Interpersonal exploitation. It's important to note that with NPD and also BPD, interpersonal exploitation is more associated with emotional exploitation, right? Like, for example, I may date somebody for the purpose of status, while something like ASPD would be more associated with a material gain. People with NPD typically aren't going to purposely exploit people for the purpose of like money per se. I mean, they might, but like it's not as common as the emotional exploitation is. And arrogant or haughty attitudes or behaviors, I think that kind of is self-explanatory. A belief in specialness and that they can only associate with other people who are also special. So there's usually this kind of arbitrary sense, like usually it's something like intelligence. It's like, oh, I'm smarter than most people. I should only be around people who are smart. And a lot of the times this actually reflects some self-esteem functioning too. Because in my mind, if I'm associating with somebody who is of lower intelligence or lower status, I'm thinking, oh, well, that means I'm of lower intelligence or lower status, right? I believe that like, or people won't perceive me like that. So this can be, so the people I surround myself with become a reflection of who I am and how I present to other people. Entitlement. This is probably my weakest trait, so I have a hard time really talking about it like at length. It's kind of like it usually manifests as like, oh, I'm such a great friend to you. Why aren't you dropping everything to help me? Like once my car battery was dead at my house. I didn't have anywhere to go. I just wanted it fixed. And I texted my buddy being like, hey, can you help me jump my car? And he was like, yeah, I'm like running an errand right now. Once that's done, I'll come help you. And looking back on it, it's kind of ridiculous, but I became like irate saying that like he was like an ungrateful piece of crap because he didn't like immediately drop everything to help me. I was like, I would do that for you. But that's really how entitlement presents for me. Grandiose fantasy of unlimited power, success, ideal love, wealth. Basically just everything I do kind of gets, and it makes it really hard to discern what my actual goals are and what are just grandiose fantasies. Like everything I do gets kind of a grandiose component to it. Like, I try to like keep myself busy with a lot of hobbies. Once I was teaching myself how to code, and like the entire time, all I could think about was how I'm going to be the greatest coder of all time. We'll make this super smart AI and change the world. And every hobby, everything I do presents like that. There's always this almost a grandiose expectation about it. Or when I enter a relationship, it's always like, oh, this is going to be the perfect love for me. We're going to be the best. This is going to be the best relationship ever. This is my soulmate. Stuff like that. And then those relationships tend to go down the drain once they don't live up to those expectations. And then lack of empathy. There's some debate how this presents normally. For me, I completely lack any sort of it confuses me, the idea of me being upset because somebody else is upset. Like that feels fake to me. And for a long time, I like literally thought other people were faking it. I thought they just felt like that was just what they had to do to kind of be normal and stuff like, or like to be polite. There is also, but I think more commonly it presents as we don't even think about other people interactions. People with MPD will kind of be like, it's like a bowl in a china shop or something. Well, like I have a goal, I'm going to get that goal. It's not even occurring to me what else how that can impact other people. And it often surprises me when it does. And like, I might feel ashamed once I realize that I did impact somebody like that. But I don't really feel guilt. Anyways, aside from that, as I said, emotional dysregulation is very common. Substance abuse goes along very often with it. I would say there is some evidence that, like with BPD, there is a degree of stress-induced transient psychosis that can occur, but that evidence is weaker than it is for BPD. That actually used to be in the criteria for in the DSM-3 revised though. And I think that is most of what I want to say about that.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. Do we have a question? Yeah. Let's see if you can hear it.
Okay. Kind of.
I'm on the Zoom, so I can unmute because I'm kind of in the back.
Yeah. Want to try zooming?
Yeah.
Yeah, that works.
See, wait, can you mute. Okay, can you hear me normally now? Okay,
There's
well,
a little bit of
kind
echo, but I think I can work with it.
So, okay, my question is, so let me put my video on so you can see me.
Right.
So my question is, I have bipolar disorder, and sometimes during my manic episodes, like I have like similar symptoms to what you're saying, like grandiose thinking, like sense of self-importance, like when you said, what's it called? When you said, like one time, like, I was like, oh, this person's my soulmate. Like, someone I met, like,
Yeah.
literally that day, I was like, oh, this person's my soulmate. Like, and then literally, like, when I came down, I was like, I literally, like, don't feel anything. But, like, I recognize that that was a symptom, or, like, kind of, like, sense of self-importance. Like, I'm on top of the world. Like, I'm the coolest, I'm the smartest person that anyone will get to meet. So, is there, like, any, like, difference between those symptoms that, like, because, like, someone could misdiagnose someone having a manic episode as like a narcissist. So what are your thoughts on that? I'd love to know.
That's an awesome question, actually. There's actually that's actually substantiated in research. There's actually a lot of overlap between bipolar and NPD, and it's actually one of the most common misdiagnoses. Actually, I was misdiagnosed as bipolar before I was officially diagnosed as NPD. So basically, you do want so superficially, because of self-esteem fluctuations, MPD can look superficially very similar to bipolar. The differences are that while there is mood fluctuations in NPD, they won't meet the criteria for a manic episode or a depressive episode. Someone with NPD may go from grandiose to vulnerable like multiple times a day. Someone with bipolar has to be over 2 weeks. 2 weeks, right? I think so. Yes. So, and also there's not going to be as much impulsivity in NPD. NPD can be very impulsive, but not to the degree that that mania tends to actually cause. And then also there was, I had a really good one. What was it? Oh no. Mania tends to be a little bit more delusional than NPD is, which is a weird thing to say if I'm being honest. But generally it's going to be a lot. There's going to be like someone with NPD will exaggerate and boast, and they can seem kind of like, it's like, okay, you're being kind of delusional right now. But somebody who is manic will have ideas like, oh, I'm going to win all this money at the lottery and stuff like that. Someone with NPD isn't going to have that level of detachment from reality.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions for the first prompt? Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry how long-winded I am, by the way.
totally
Does
fine.
it go through?
Was it in the chat?
I'll take it,
Oh,
and I can say it.
or actually, you might be, because the speakers are right here. Let's see, the
Okay.
microphones. What was that?
I can't tell.
Hello.
Ask a question?
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, because the microphone, we're getting a question in. You see these?
Okay. I trust you.
Go ahead.
What is the usual or average age for diagnosis of a personality disorder?
Complicated question. Good one though. Very good question. So typically, these symptoms start to present during early adolescence or early adulthood. Most clinicians don't like diagnosing before the age of 18. That's not a diagnostic requirement though, except for ASPD. My personal opinion though is that it's complicated because I noticed symptoms in myself, like at least looking back on it, I've noticed symptoms in myself since I was like between the ages of like 10 and 12 or something. But it's hard to say when those became very problematic, and early intervention is like very important, but most don't really diagnose before 18. As for the average age that is diagnosed, it's usually there's like 2 big points in people with NPD's lives where typically they go into treatment and get a diagnosis, which is like right after graduating like college. They have a failure to launch syndrome a lot of the time, and they're often pressured into therapy, or more towards their middle ages when they're kind of realizing that their grandiose fantasies aren't going to come true, or they are going through some crisis like a divorce or something. So generally, I would say early 20s or in your 40s is typically the ages that you're going to see. But of course, there's going to be exceptions to all of that.
Go ahead. Follow up.
How do you think this age recommendation affects the misdiagnosis or the chance of
I would affects the misdiagnosis. Well, I feel like I would feel like for the most part, I would say I think people like in their early 20s and stuff like that, a lot of the emotional dysregulation, or hell, even in the in teenage years, a lot of the times that can be seen as a like young adult being just emotional, right? It can be this emotional dysregulation can be dismissed as not a symptom and as like, I don't know, hormones or just being rowdy, right? And so I feel like a lot of clinicians tend to dismiss some of those symptoms when they aren't seeing the full degree of it. But I guess I guess that's the only thing I when it says to misdiagnosis, I guess I can't really think of much other how that impacts it specifically.
Yeah, thanks. Another follow-up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you speak a lot about these fluctuations, right, between like grandiosity and then vulnerability, but also there's some things that are stagnant, like lack of empathy, you said. So I was just wondering, like, what symptomology kind of changes over time and what kind of stays the same as just like baseline?
Awesome. Okay, that's a good question. So interestingly enough, I would say, so let's see. I would say because it's less of them changing and then more of what's just presented overtly or covertly. I typically do have a lot of symptomology of both vulnerable and grandiose narcissism at most times. It's just kind of what I'm presenting to the world. Like, for example, my grandiosity. Like I always do have grandiosity to some degree, right? But then when I'm vulnerable, it's hidden or presents in a different way. I would say the things that are most different is for example, I tend to be very extroverted when I feel more grandiose. If I was vulnerable right now, I wouldn't be doing this, right? I'll even like hide in my room out of like shame when I'm vulnerable because I'm afraid that like the world is going to judge me. So I say extroversion is a big one. Also just my emotional stability. I'm much more prone to outbursts when I'm vulnerable, much more prone to lashing out and like paranoid thinking. Let me think of other things. I would say that I get a lot more self-defeating when I am in a vulnerable state, like a lot more like negative self-talk. It's always kind of there, but like it's a lot more overt. And at times, this isn't super common, but for a lot of people with NPD, they may even revert to like self-harm and stuff like that when they're in a vulnerable state. I would say, honestly, the thing that changes the most, and I would say symptoms, like in the diagnostic criteria, it says envious of others or believes others are envious of him. When I'm grandiose, I believe others are envious of me. When I'm vulnerable, I'm envious of other people. Or there was another one. I completely forgot what the other one was. But okay, I think that there's a couple examples there.
That was great.
I just realized I forgot to take my medication. I'm so sorry. 1 second.
No problem.
Because I'm like, why can't I focus? I'm like, oh, right, my second dose of Adderall. I have ADHD too.
Any other follow-up questions before we move on to 2? No? Okay, Jacob. Second question. So what are some key differences between healthy self-esteem and the excessive self-involvement observed in individuals with NPD? I know you touched upon a little bit in the criteria at the beginning, but maybe let's focus on that.
Okay, yeah. So this is a really good question because I hear a lot of people say like when they talk about the spectrum of narcissism, they talk about like, oh, that you can have healthy narcissism and then extreme narcissism, which becomes pathological. I'm going to say most of this is conjecture on my part. I have some of my friends who are in academia who agree with me, but like this is more of a me thing generally. But how I view it is that people who have healthy self-esteem, healthy self-love, healthy narcissism, these people are actually happy with who they are. They have a genuine sense of self-confidence. So they may be admiring themselves, but they aren't going to be looking out to other people in order to bolster that. I think that's how, and I think that we need to kind of reframe it as pathological narcissism is a lack of healthy narcissism. There is no healthy narcissism with that individual. So they're trying to get that from external sources, right? So I would say that it's less about what the differences are and more about how to differentiate them. And I think that the way to differentiate them the most reliably is the person's need for you to tell them they're great. If you insult somebody who genuinely likes themselves, they're going to be able to brush it off. A narcissist, on the other hand, depending on what you say, is either going to react in a rage or they're going to like shut down and go into like a shame spiral or something.
Yeah. Any follow-up to that question? No? Okay. I know you gave some of these examples earlier, but we'll focus on it again.
Okay.
How does NPD impact interpersonal relationships, both personally and professionally?
Ugh. Poorly is what I'll say. Yeah, so I find it very hard to keep long, like especially romantic relationships for long periods of time. Because I'm very prone to feeling offended or like somebody's trying to so it's just remind me of I'm sorry, I got distracted. Somebody just said that I advise them take their meds. That's funny because my outro on my YouTube videos is take your fucking meds, please. So I'm doing the job still. Anyways, but yeah, so I would say that generally speaking, I would say the thing that impacts my interpersonal relationships the most is like my lack of ability to be vulnerable with them and how I resist at every turn vulnerability. But on the other hand, this leads to them still trying to be vulnerable with me and me kind of feigning certain degrees of vulnerability, which actually gives me, because I'm very, I guess I should have mentioned this toward the beginning. I am very prone to shame. Shame is like almost a constant emotion that I feel well, once I didn't fix it, but alexithymia is also a big thing in narcissism. I barely know what I'm feeling ever. I had 3 emotions growing up: good, bad, and angry. And the shame, so that shame is like constant. But anyways, so when these people feel close to me and they'll like express to me how they love me, sometimes I get mad because I'm like, you don't actually know who I even am. And sometimes I feel shame about it, thinking, wow, I tricked them into thinking that they know this person who I actually am not. Stuff like that. And then when I get into close relationships, when that vulnerability starts to come out, because to a certain degree it's inevitable, that will lead to me having like usually subconscious like urges to push them away and lash out, which usually leads to the end of those friendships and relationships. When it comes to professional life, I would say the most obvious thing is that everything I do is based off of the need to increase my, like, for status. Everything is just to like make everybody else impressed and stuff like that. I don't know if I actually have anything I'm really passionate about other than what will make me look good. I mean, hell, I worked at a prison for 2 years because I thought it was an impressive job to have. I joined the military for the same reason. I worked as a financial advisor for the same reason. I didn't really have an interest in any of those things. Also, I have a very hard time with authority which is why the military sucked for me. But like, basically, since I mentioned earlier that I view things through a hierarchy, when I have a boss, that person is objectively higher on the hierarchy than me. And so therefore, his opinion matters more than like anybody below him on the hierarchy. So the slightest thing that they say can leave me just like destroyed. Like literally once I don't even remember what he said, but I remember the feeling. I remember we were having a little conference at my job, and the boss said something that like I interpreted at least as negative. It wasn't like anything major, like, but like I literally left. I left work and I just went home and hid in my room. And I might have made a YouTube video. I don't remember, but yeah, like the symptom can be very what's it called? Just disruptive to my work life. And I know other people who have like gone more on the aggressive side when reacted to like that. I've never had the balls to be aggressive towards my superiors though.
Thank you. Follow-up for those questions. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So you had mentioned earlier in your presentation that people with NPD typically want to associate with other people who they feel are of a higher status or special. How does this like affect the relationship between 2 people that both have NPD, where they tend to get along well?
Sorry, what was that?
Like, how would this affect like the relationship between 2 people that would both have NPD?
Okay, yes. So that's a really good question. So generally speaking, if I have I have a friend who has NPD as well, and it kind of takes 2 forms usually. The first thing is what a lot of people don't really remember or know about, I guess, is that a lot of the times my grandiosity, I will like export to the people around me. It's like, it's not that I'm the best, it's how we're the best. So this is the best group of people. I mean, I may like imply that I'm better than that person, but like we're better than everybody else, right? So to narcissists, and actually there's a study that reflects this. I need to look that one up because I forget what it's called. But basically, people in romantic relationships, narcissists in romantic relationships, they actually have, relatively speaking, usually pretty positive relationships because they're both bolstering each other's self-esteem. On the other hand, though, it's when that grandiosity becomes kind of isolated and there becomes some envy and contention between the two. For example, me and a very close friend of mine, she also does some social media stuff regarding NPD. And for a long time, we were somewhat like even in like how many followers and stuff that we had. And so we could view each other as equals, right? And so there wasn't much envy. We were both the best. Then my stuff started to like take off a little bit more than hers. And that actually led to some fights between us because like of her envy. And she's like, I deserve that too. And that led to some contention. So it can devolve very quickly into competitiveness if it's allowed to. But generally speaking, it's pretty positive, I would say.
Another follow-up.
Is there like a common attachment style that people display?
Yes. Usually the most common attachment style for NPD is, if I remember correctly, it's a disorganized attachment style. However, it trends more towards dismissive avoidant attachment style.
Great question. Any other follow-ups?
Actually, reflecting back, like, do you think you recognize you were different at a younger age, or felt the need to like hide your symptoms, or like, do you ever feel the need to fake empathy for your relationships?
Sorry, can you repeat that first part?
Reflecting back, like, were you able to recognize your own symptoms as like when you were younger, and did you feel like ashamed of them, or simply just like feeling grandiose? Did you feel ashamed of that as well, and did you feel the need to hide it?
Okay, so yes, actually, I recognized some of my. I didn't know exactly. Like, I always knew something was off. It was kind of hard to go throughout the world without kind of noticing something was wrong. It was just the way that people. I always described it as like, I always viewed people as like machines or like a math equation that like I didn't really know what happened inside of it, but I knew what numbers to type in to get what I wanted out. And it felt like everyone else just went up to it and just like bashed on the keyboard and just didn't know what they were doing. I knew my grandiosity and arrogance was off-putting to people a lot. Well, I figured that out eventually, at least. And I was very careful to eventually present myself in a much more humble manner, probably around I don't know, how old was I? I was probably around 19 when I figured that out. I presented myself in a much more like humble manner because I knew people would like me more if I didn't look like a narcissist, basically. As for empathy is something I've always known to fake, but again, I was like, it did make me, there was some like, that goes into my childhood a little bit, so I won't touch on that too much, but basically, there has always been a sense of being almost inhuman or monstrous that went along with the lack of empathy, or just kind of my callousness, and thus a need to hide it and a fear of what would happen if other people were to learn. But I would flip-flop back and forth between that kind of sentiment of I'm a monster that's cold, and then thinking, no, everyone's faking it. I'm just the only one that's aware that I'm faking it because I'm so smart and self-aware. Ironic when I look back on it.
Any other follow-ups? No? Okay, we're gonna get to the next one. All right, Jacob, could you discuss any potential comorbidities or co-occurring mental health conditions that are often associated with NPD?
Yes, there's a lot of them. So the most obvious ones are other cluster B disorders, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic. More often than not, if you have personality disorder, you're going to have significant traits from other disorders within the same cluster. I think it's up to around 50% of people with BPD have comorbid NPD. And I think it's like 80% or something of people with NPD have like at least borderline traits. So very often you're going to be dealing with multiple personality disorders, and you're just going to have to kind of be like, well, which one is more predominant, whatever, if you're to come to a diagnosis. And then if we're getting out of the clusters, though, that's very often associated with generalized anxiety disorder and depression, and also substance abuse. Substance abuse, I think, it affects over half. Substance abuse disorders affect over like half of people with NPD. PTSD as well also affects them very significantly, and to a slightly lesser degrees, ADHD, with both borderline and narcissistic, if I'm correct, both have increased risk for ADHD comorbidities. And I'll be honest, I would say, but I would say most of these, I would say it's very, it'd be strange if you didn't meet a narcissist that didn't have some degree of anxiety or depression. Social anxiety disorder is also very, very common.
Any follow-ups? Yeah.
Could it be that like for the anxiety and depression scales of things that like that is by nature of sort of the isolation that comes with the disorder and sort of the social interactions that you have to go through, I guess?
I've thought about that a lot, actually. And I guess I would say I'm not entirely sure. I would say that because I know so like obviously the social impacts that my functioning has obviously impacts my mood and can lead to depression and stuff like that. But I also know people who are in remission who a lot of the internal experience, like emptiness and stuff like that, doesn't really go away. I would say that there's significant contributors to it, but like how my functioning operates and stuff like that. But I'm not sure if that's the totality of it.
Yeah.
Any other follow-ups? That prompt? No. Okay, we're going to move on to 5. So, Jacob, are there any effective therapeutic approaches or interventions that have shown promise in treating individuals with NPD?
Yes. So, well, first off, if we just look at transference-focused psychotherapy, there's one study that shows about a 53% remission rate, which isn't amazing, but obviously it can, under the right circumstance, help. I know dialectical behavioral therapy is very helpful for people with NPD because they suffer from similar emotional dysregulation that people with BPD have. I know that there is mentalization-based treatment. I had the honor of actually interviewing Andrew Bateman, and a leader in developing NBT for borderline patients, and one of his colleagues, and they're actually working on one specifically for NPD right now. And as somebody who has did some mock sessions with that, I think mentalization-based treatment is awesome, and I highly recommend it for personality disorders. Because a lot of it is challenging some of the flawed cognitions and perceptions that we have. Schema-based therapy, I hear, is very good for it, but I don't know much about it other than that. One of my close friends, Dr. Ruth Ann Harper, she's a schema therapist and she specializes in treating NPD, and she's had good experiences with that. Other than, I think those are and in terms of medication, medication is usually used to treat symptoms like anxiety, depression, or the mood swings, stuff like that. Not anything for the disorder itself, though.
I have a follow-up just for the students learning. Can you give us an example of mentalization therapy and maybe just one concrete session, what it would look like?
Okay, so because I have a limited experience with it, obviously, but basically, I really so let's say you go into the office and start talking about your day. What the therapist does is he notices you'll have a certain assumption about yourself or others, about how others perceive you, and then they go on to challenge why you think that, or something or for example, I once said, oh, this person doesn't like me, or I don't think this person likes me, or something. And so he's like, okay, why do you think this person doesn't like you? And then in explaining why that person doesn't like me, it can go to kind of the deeper underlying thoughts that kind of power that open thought. It's really hard for me to explain. I'm sorry. I'm not an expert in MBD at all. I do have a video, not my own video, but somebody else's video on it that I can send, though. That's really cool, that I very much recommend.
Yeah, that would be great. Any other follow-ups? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Um, so you were talking earlier, well, hi.
Hello.
You were talking earlier about how NPD tends to negatively impact your like social relationships or like interpersonal relationships. So I was curious as to kind of how you combat that. So like what do you think positively impacts your quality of life in general while having this disorder?
Honestly, like just for me personally, like I basically just question everything is kind of my go-to. Like I'm very prone to assuming somebody is trying to insult me or like one up me, stuff like that. I basically have to stop myself at every interaction and think, is this real or are you being crazy right now? And stuff like that. It's just a lot of thought that goes into challenging my instincts and trying to prevent me from acting on those instincts in ways that aren't accurate and that would negatively impact my relationships. But honestly, I'm not very good. My relationships are still a mess. I don't know. Like I might not be the person to ask.
Thank you.
Well, was there another question? Yes.
This might have an obvious answer, but what does remission for personality disorders look like?
So obviously not meeting the criteria, right? But from somebody who like knows people who are in remission, the issue with the diagnostic criteria is the fact that it only talks about the external symptoms. For example, I have a good friend who is in remission and she still goes through self-esteem fluctuations. She still feels empty a lot. She still feels the need to, she still really can't really connect with people, or at least struggles to. It's like ultimately remission for personality disorders is just that you're not messing up the lives around you, despite how internally you feel, unfortunately.
Any other follow-ups? Okay, we're going to continue down the list. Sounds good?
Great.
Okay, Jacob, can you share some insights on the challenges clinicians may face when working with individuals diagnosed with NPD and how they can navigate these challenges effectively?
Ooh. Man, I gotta share this recording to my therapist for sure then. But I would say the most common thing that people experience is what Kohal refers to as a narcissistic transference, which is transferences don't happen. Basically, a lot of people are expecting the client to project like parental figures and stuff onto the clinician. Narcissists don't do that. We just project aspects of ourselves onto the clinician. And from the clinician's perspective, it just doesn't feel like any sort of connection is happening. And this can lead to some countertransferences that can be challenging. So there's frustration. I got my therapist cursed at me once. It was hilarious. Frustration, boredom, a sense of hopelessness or inability to do your job correctly, stuff like that. And I would say, but I remember Dr. Frank Yeomans was talking about one of his first narcissistic patients, and he was talking to his mentor about it. And he was basically like, nothing's happening in this, like, no, there's no connection going on. I don't even know why she keeps coming in. And his mentor just said, just stick with it. Like, I think something will happen. And he was right. Within a few more sessions, like the client actually started opening up. From my perspective, what happens is I go into a therapy session and I'm not thinking, oh, I'm having a relationship with this person and working through. So I'm like, this is a tool, help me fix myself, right? In reference to the therapist. But I still care largely what this therapist thinks about me. So I might be kind of dodging certain questions or very closed off to my shame, right? I don't trust anybody, let alone somebody that I'm paying to see me. I mean, I remember my therapist once mentioned, like referred to it as a relationship. And I said, what relationship? I'm paying you to help me. What are you crazy, weirdo? But eventually I did. And like, I was very much withholding a lot of myself and my emotions, feelings, struggles, whatever. And one day I remember, and like, this is 2 years into treatment, mind you. So like, I've basically been like just wasting me and her time like for 2 years. And one day, just out of nowhere, I just had like this moment of like, I was like complaining about somebody. And like, I kind of chuckled to myself. I just said, well, okay, I can't blame them though. I mean, they're all so stupid. And she's like, what? Because before then I had been presenting myself as very humble and kind. And I just started laughing at myself saying, I mean, they all complain that I think that I'm better than them. But I mean, look at them and look at me. How can you like, of course I'm better than them. And it was like a whole moment. But that was the first actual like real interaction I had in therapy. And it was like really I would say that was like the turning point in my treatment. There's also going to be like, I also view things through this lens of like a power struggle. A lot of conversations that I have, I view as like, who's in control of the situation. And therapy, this gets very like I as a client believed my therapist was trying to manipulate me into thinking certain things constantly. Not out of malice. I just thought that's kind of how therapy worked. It's like, oh, you're trying to lead me to this conclusion about myself, but I already know that. And I think that's stupid. So I'm going to try to lead you to this. So there's always going to be they're always going to perceive a certain degree of power struggle within this, within the sessions and stuff like that. And again, that's also something that I believe this kind of just takes time for the person with NPD to come to trust the clinician and be more open and honest with them.
Follow up.
Wait, mute for a second.
Yep.
Hey, so I have another question. So like kind of like going off of what you were talking about then, has it been difficult for you to like maintain friendships and stuff like that? Like, do you have like, I don't want to be like, oh, do you have friends? But like,
No, you're fine.
I want to, like, I just like, how has your disorder like affected your like ability to like maintain friendships and stuff like that? Like, how do you feel in that regard?
Right. Are you calling me a loser? No, but
No, like, that was the whole point.
Good question though, because it has impacted my ability to keep friends. Like I always say to people, I make great first impressions. It's all downhill from there. For most of my life, I have basically gone from friend group to friend group, where I am very well liked and popular at first, and over the course of a year or so, I slowly burn every bridge that's there. I do have a few friends that like have known me for long enough that they just kind of know how I am, and it's just not a big deal anymore. But like most of my life has just been me just I just keep moving on, except for like a handful of people who I've kept my entire life.
Any other follow-ups? Okay, moving along, Jacob. 7, are there any specific ethical considerations or guidelines that mental health professionals should be aware of when working with clients who present with NPD?
This one, like I remember reading this one, I was like, ooh, this is gonna be the hardest one for me, because I'm not really sure exactly. The only thing I can really think of is, again, like you need to be aware of like how you're going to react to a client population like this. As I said, I got my therapist to curse at me. I don't think that happens very often. And there is a lot of times that like people like just they don't have the temperament that would lead to a good treatment outcome for somebody with a personality disorder. And I feel like that's something that people need to become aware of very quickly when thinking about this client population, because you might be the client might be bad for you, and you might be bad for the client. And I think there's no shame being able to admit that's like, okay, this is a population of people that like I don't enjoy working with, I can't work with, that impacts my mental health in negative ways. And people shouldn't be caught up on like, and people shouldn't do that as a reflection of how good of a therapist they are or clinician that they are or whatever.
Any follow-up to that? No? Okay, moving right along. How can individuals with NPD be encouraged to seek treatment or therapy, given the common reluctance to acknowledge their own faults or vulnerabilities?
So I think this is I look at this through 2 angles. One, getting them into treatment, which I think that issue is less prominent than a lot of people think. There's estimates that say like 8 to 20% of outpatient treatment is actually comprised of people with NPD. They didn't specify whether or not those people were aware they had NPD, right? But who knows? And I think that it's something that largely falls within the education of communities to be able to kind of recognize that people are suffering from mental health conditions, and to be able to recognize it and to kind of alleviate a lot of the shame behind it. When I was younger and when people were trying to get me into therapy, people would say, "Oh, you're depressed." And I'm like, everyone says they're depressed. I don't want to be one of those like people that just like complain about everything. I'm strong. So being able to reframe it in a way that that elicits less shame, I think is a important step. And also when it comes to people being able to see these traits in NPD in themselves, a similar thing I think has to happen, where we kind of move away from the caricature of NPD that we have in media right now that isn't constructive. And like, if you are somebody that's prone to shame and you go and you're struggling, you're struggling, you're trying to figure out what's wrong with you, go on the internet, you come across NPD, you're not going to be thinking, "Oh, this describes me." You're going to be thinking, "Well, this isn't me. I'm not like this evil, manipulative mastermind trying to hurt people every chance I get." And so these people will not think that that is an issue that they struggle with, or maybe they think that's something else. I can't tell you how many people reach out to me and say, "Hey, because of your videos, I can actually accept my diagnosis now, because like it's the first time that it's like seemed realistic and made sense." So I feel like just further education in the public eye is honestly the best way to be able to encourage more people into treatment and proper treatment.
Any follow-up questions? We addressed 9, so I'm going to skip to 10.
Okay.
Can you discuss any recent research findings or advancements in our understanding of NPD that may be relevant for mental health professionals in clinical practice?
Yes, there's 3 studies that I can think of off the top of my head that I think are very important. 2 of them talk about the oscillations between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. I don't feel like that's as properly or widely understood as it should be. One is called Living with Pathological Narcissism, a quantitative study. Basically, they interviewed a bunch of people who, instead of using self-report measures, who lived with people with this disorder, and took reports from them and just made a cluster analysis of how these traits correlated. I think it showed that like around 69% of the people with the condition presented with both grandiose and vulnerable symptoms. There's also another one called the nonlinear relationship between vulnerable and grandiose narcissism. This basically showed that at the lower 70th percentile of the symptom of grandiosity, there wasn't a correlation between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. But once you hit 70 past that percentile, there was the top 30 percentile that showed a very, very positive correlation, like a very significant one. And we could argue that that could be a pathological cutoff point for treatment. So I think properly understanding the dynamics of grandiosity and vulnerability, very important, and those are very important studies. Another one I found was interesting, but I can't remember what it was called, but I think is a really good, beginning to some of the neurological analyses of this disorder. It's on my computer somewhere, I could look it up, but basically it showed that the areas of the brain in people with this was subclinical narcissism in fairness, so take this as you will, but it showed that people with higher subclinical narcissism actually had lower connectivity between the parts of their brain that was associated with positive self-regard and reward. And they hypothesized in this paper that the reason that the self-aggrandizement and attention-seeking behaviors happen in this disorder is to kind of make up for that lack of connectivity, for lack of a better word. I think that's a really great place to start in terms of looking at this disorder through a neurological perspective. And those are the main ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Great. Any follow-up? I have a follow-up. So based on those data, how may they inform new treatments?
Good question. Really good question, honestly. And I'll be frank. When it comes, I am way less equipped to propose new treatment modalities or anything in regards to helping things like that. I more just enjoy looking at the data, the research, and how these symptoms present and the internal experience, because I find it very fascinating. I guess I would say that when it comes to a neurological basis, being able to identify some of these traits through the brain could be helpful in giving a proper treatment. And I would feel like knowing some of the reactions that somebody may have to potential self-esteem threats when it comes to oscillation between grandiosity and vulnerability can be helpful, right? Because a lot of people, what I see a lot is that a lot of people are concerned saying, oh, well, is this bolstering your, is this like feeding your ego? And it's like, well, kind of, yeah. But like at the same time, if like, and so people feel this need to kind of challenge me to like bring down my grandiosity. But the thing is, if I'm in a grandiose state and you challenge my grandiosity and you're successful in bringing it down, it's not like you're pouring a little bit of water out of a cup. It's that you poked a hole at the bottom of the cup and now I'm completely in a vulnerable state and in a shame spiral. So being able to understand how to kind of how your actions can kind of trigger these oscillations, I think could be very helpful for a therapist to be able to understand what to do and what not to do to trigger some of these shame responses or defense mechanisms.
Follow up.
This isn't a follow-up
Oh.
to this. It's kind of going back to the question about like how clinicians can deal with the challenges they face. And I feel like the strategies you said were just like giving the patient time, reframing symptoms. Specifically for friends that are like, that know people with friends or family that have NPD, what's a good way to provide like social support, especially in a time of like a shame spiral or just like trying to relate to them?
Okay, that's a good question. So first of all, I want to point out that like, everyone's different. So it's hard to have one cohesive kind of one holistic thing that you can do. I do, before I get into like my personal opinions on it, I do want to recommend Disarming the Narcissist by Wendy T. Berry for people in those situations, because she wrote it specifically for people who either wanted to make a relationship with somebody at NPD work or had a co-parenting situation or a family member, etc. So it has like a lot of good strategies for talking about that. And it was written by like a clinician. So anyways, I would say, so when I'm in a shame spiral, I want to draw upon what one of my very, very close friends, like I refer to them as my confidant, kind of said about that, is that when I'm in a mood like that and I'm in a shame spiral, it always, they describe it as, I just want to be heard in that moment, is that the person themselves, I'm not really going to get much of emotional support out of any sort of like soothing and stuff like that most of the time. It's more about me just like being able to feel like I'm being understood, because that is a chronic issue that I have, is I chronically feel like people don't actually understand me or who I really am and stuff like that. And a lot of the times people try to be supportive. Like, let's say somebody is like, oh, I completely understand what you're going through. I take offense to that, weirdly enough. I'm like, no, you don't. You have no idea how bad my suffering is. And it feels a lot of times invalidating. The biggest issue though, that really does come up is that a lot of times this does lead to the narcissistic individual going into a lot of self-isolation, as I mentioned earlier. That there's not much you can do, because that I personally, if I was being said to leave me alone, a lot of the time I don't want to be left alone, but I'm just saying it because I feel like it would be pathetic for me not to, but I'll still probably react with rage if somebody tries to impede on that. So I wouldn't recommend trying to pry somebody out of make the option available and stuff like that. But trying to pull somebody out of that self-isolation, at least in my experience, doesn't go well typically. But again, everyone's different. They may not react the same way that I would. That's most of what I have to say on that. Honestly, I barely know how to handle myself, so it's hard for me to give good advice.
So you mentioned before that many personality disorders have overlapping symptoms, and people may have like 2 of these personality disorders. So how does that affect treatment? And does this allow clinicians to tailor treatment to an individual?
Yeah. So the more pathological personality traits somebody has, there's going to be a lot of complications in treatment, especially in the ways that the symptoms can kind of interact with each other, so to speak. But that is kind of the usefulness of having diagnostic categories and stuff like that, is that clinicians can more accurately see what the underlying issues are and be able to be like, oh, okay, this is the pattern of behaviors and this is why this is happening, and be able to tailor treatment accordingly. There is a lot of research on comorbid NPD and BPD that would be helpful for clinicians and stuff like that when it goes to several personality disorders out like within different clusters, those are typically very challenging cases that there isn't a whole lot of research to really that could really provide much help or insight to a clinician, unfortunately.
And maybe we'll wrap up with misconceptions and myths about NPD, messages that you want to leave this audience with.
So my best advice for anybody who wants to fully understand narcissistic personality disorder is, I don't know, read everything you can on the internet and then know all of it is a lie. No, but like, it's just the misconceptions on narcissism run very deep in modern society right now. I think a lot of people can acknowledge that the stigma around it has become more or less a business model of being able to sensationalize narcissism and the negative impacts on society that it has. And not to say that there is no negative impacts that a narcissist can have on society or their personal relationships, but the way that it's described is not very accurate. I would say the most common one that I always want to point out is that like narcissists aren't out there trying to be like, oh, I want to take advantage of all these people. I'm hunting people for supply and I want to abuse them and stuff like that. They aren't inherently malicious people. They're mentally ill and struggle to operate in the world in a way that is constructive to the world around them. I would say that the self-love thing that I mentioned at the beginning, narcissists don't love themselves. They just occasionally think they're better than everybody else, depending on their mood. There's a lot of self-hatred that goes with narcissism. There's not much positive self-regard. So those are probably the two biggest ones. Let me see if I can think of anything else that really comes to mind. And I would say the third one, I think that's very important to emphasize in this setting, especially, is that narcissism is treatable, hands down. NPD is treatable without a doubt. Narcissism and NPD are conditions that are difficult to deal with, but I have heard amazing success stories with some people who have NPD. And I've heard some people who don't get help. But just like all patient populations, there are going to be subsets of these groups that are resistant to treatment. But it's very much treatable. And I hope as research goes on that we can find better ways to treat it, as opposed to, because we don't really have much that is specifically oriented for it right now.
All right, I think we're wrapped up. Can we give Jacob a round of applause? Okay.
Wait, did people actually clap? Because I didn't hear anything.
Oh, you did it? Really?
I was like, whoa, I did that bad of a job. Crap.
Now, it's a class about 24 students, so we're all here, and we can't thank you enough for talking to us about this really important presentation and the work we need to do. So
I appreciate it.
Be on the lookout in your email for a gift card. It's the least I could do to pay for your time. So
that's awesome. Thank you so much.
If students want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
So keep in mind, I can't get to, like, I try to look at my messages, but since I have like 100,000 people on TikTok right now, it gets very difficult. I would say the best way to reach me would be through my email or through my DMs on Instagram. My email is thenamelessnarcissist@gmail.com, and my Instagram goes by the Nameless Narcissist as well. I cannot promise I will get to you. I will try, and if you get one response from me, that's probably all you're going to get. So like put everything in the first message because I will forget about it later.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. One more time. Let's see if we got it. Can you get that?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would all say thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that works better.
Okay. Thanks, Jacob. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you guys so much. You've been a lovely audience.
Yes. All right. Bye.